If you grew up in the 70s, you probably remember dinners that looked simple, but somehow always filled the table. Things like chili and cornbread, Hamburger Stew, or grilled cheese with tomato soup. Today we're revisiting 25 dishes families really ate back then. Some will bring back memories instantly. Others you may not have thought about in decades. Mac and cheese. Kraft Blue Box was 19 cents in the mid-70s, and it showed up on dinner tables every single week across the country. You boiled those pale elbow noodles, drained them in a metal colander, and stirred in margarine, milk, and that foil packet of fluorescent orange powder. Every noodle came out coated in something creamy and salty and unmistakably itself. It got doctored constantly. A can of tuna stirred in, hot dog slices, a handful of frozen peas. Whatever needed using up went into the pot and made it stretch a little further. Rich households and struggling ones ate the same blue box, which gave it a kind of democratic status nothing else on the dinner table had. Leftovers got reheated in the same pot the next day. Nobody complained. Mock apple pie. When apples got expensive during the 1973 recession, Nabisco started printing a recipe right on the Ritz cracker box. The claim was serious. You could make a pie that tasted like apple pie with no apples at all. You broke crackers into rough pieces, layered them in a pie crust, poured a hot syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice over them, added cinnamon and dots of butter, covered it with a top crust, and baked it until golden. The crackers softened and absorbed the syrup, creating something with real texture and genuine sweetness. Church potluck guests were reportedly fooled more than once. The pie cost a third of what real apple pie cost and used nothing that could spoil. Some people who tried it genuinely couldn't believe there was no fruit inside. Classic chili and cornbread. A single pound of ground beef fed 6 people in a pot of chili. You browned the meat, drained the fat, added kidney beans, canned tomatoes, onions, chili powder, and cumin. Then let it simmer for a couple of hours until the broth thickened and the whole house smelled smoky and warm. The cornbread came from a box of Jiffy Mix. 19 cents, 1 egg, some milk, baked in a cast iron skillet until the edges went slightly crispy. You broke a piece off and held it over the bowl, let it soak up the dark broth, and that was the best part of the whole meal. Leftovers improved overnight. The chili tasted deeper and richer reheated the next evening, which meant one cooking session covered 2 dinners. Hamburger Stew. When pot roast was out of the question, Hamburger Stew delivered the same kind of warmth for a fraction of the price. Ground beef brown with onions, then into the pot went rough-cut potatoes, thick carrot coins, celery, a can of tomato soup, beef bouillon, and water. It simmered for close to an hour. The potatoes released their starch into the broth, thickening it from thin liquid into something genuinely hearty. The carrots turned sweet. The whole thing smelled like the kind of dinner that made kids come in from outside without being called twice. Each bowl came out crowded and steaming, tasting more substantial than the ingredients had any right to produce. Bread on the side, if you had it. A glass of milk. That was a complete weeknight dinner. Tuna noodle casserole. 1 can of tuna, retail around 40 cents, fed 4 people. That was the math behind tuna noodle casserole. And it was the reason this dish appeared on so many Tuesday night tables when payday was still a few days away. Egg noodles, the can of tuna, cream of mushroom soup straight from the can, frozen peas, maybe some diced celery. Everything mixed in a buttered casserole dish, topped with a thick layer of crushed potato chips, then baked until the top went golden and the filling bubbled at the edges. That crunchy top made the whole dish. Each forkful combined creamy, salty filling with crispy, salty topping, the sweet peas providing a little color and contrast underneath. It was church basement food, funeral reception food, reliable food. The kind of thing that showed up because it worked every time. Hobo Stew. The name came from Depression-era cooking, and the approach was the same in both eras. Open every can in the back of the cupboard, add whatever vegetables need using, combine them in one large pot, and make dinner. Ground beef, if you had it. Potatoes, carrots, onions, can corn, can green beans, tomato sauce, whatever dried seasoning was on the rack. No recipe, no measurements. Everything went in together with enough water to cover, the heat went low, and it simmered for an hour or more. The result was thick and reddish-brown, every spoonful slightly different, depending on what you scooped up. Soft potato, sweet carrot, a bit of corn, a crumble of beef. It filled the house with a warm, generic something's cooking smell that brought kids in from outside before they even knew what was for dinner. Fried green tomatoes. Vegetable gardening exploded in the 1970s. Families who'd never grown their own food dug up backyard plots to cut grocery costs. And every autumn those gardens presented the same problem. Frost was coming and half the tomatoes would never ripen in time. You sliced the hard green tomatoes thick, pressed them in a cornmeal seasoned with salt and pepper, and set them in hot oil in a cast iron skillet. The sound when they hit the oil was immediate and sharp, that emphatic sizzle that told you the temperature was right. 3 or 4 minutes per side until the crust went golden. The finished slices were something different from anything you'd expect. The crust was crispy and savory. The tomato inside stayed firm and tart, sharp and acidic in a way cooked red tomatoes never are. Families ate them as a side dish or just standing over the stove because the first batch came off too hot to wait for a plate. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. 1.5 pounds of ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, rolled oats, diced onions, eggs, and seasoning fed 6 people comfortably. The filler was the whole point. It stretched expensive beef without changing what it tasted like. You shaped it into a loaf, spread ketchup generously across the top, and baked it for an hour. That ketchup glaze caramelized as it cooked, turning sticky and concentrated and slightly darkened at the edges, providing most of the flavor punch in the finished dish. You sliced it thick at the table. The cold version the next day, sliced thin between 2 pieces of white bread with more ketchup and some iceberg lettuce, was legitimately its own meal. Meatloaf was one of the few dishes that produced a better leftover than it did a first serving. Bean and bacon soup. Butchers sold bacon ends and pieces for almost nothing. They were the irregular scraps left from slicing whole slabs, and they had everything regular bacon had except the neat appearance. Thrifty cooks knew exactly what to do with them. You fried the pieces until the fat rendered out and the kitchen filled with that bacon smell. Sautéed onions, carrots, and celery in the drippings. Added navy beans that had soaked overnight. Covered everything with water and simmered it slowly for nearly 2 hours. By dinner, the beans had softened completely and released their starch into the broth, making it thick and creamy. The bacon flavor had spread through every spoonful. Each bowl coated your tongue with rich pork-flavored creaminess punctuated by whole beans that gave way softly when you bit into them. Lentil soup. Lentils cost almost nothing and required no overnight soaking, which made them practical in a way that dried beans sometimes weren't when you decided on dinner at 5 o'clock. A bag stretched across 2 full meals for a family. Onions, carrots, and celery softened in oil first. Then the rinsed lentils, canned tomatoes, bay leaves, plenty of salt and pepper, water to cover. 45 minutes of simmering, and the lentils dissolved into a thick, earthy, warm-colored soup that smelled of something genuinely wholesome. Back then, mainstream American families had little history with lentils. They came to them through necessity and found, more often than not, that they actually liked the result. You serve it with crusty bread for dipping, and it filled stomachs completely for pennies. Hamburger gravy on bread. Some nights the cabinet had ground beef, flour, milk, and bread. That was dinner. You browned the beef in a skillet until it had real color, not just gray, then sprinkled flour over it and stirred it in to coat every crumble. Milk went in slowly, stirring constantly, thickening around the meat into a pale, creamy gravy. Salt, pepper, garlic powder. Season and taste. Ladle it over slices of white bread laid flat on the plate. The bread absorbed the gravy immediately, going soft and heavy underneath the sauce. The taste was simple and direct. Milk gravy with crumbled meat, hot enough to warm you all the way through. It wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was, and it fed people reliably on nights when nothing else was available. Ham and bean soup. After a holiday ham dinner, the bone went straight into the refrigerator. 2 days later, it went into a stock pot and produced something that, according to many people who grew up in this era, tasted better than the original meal. dried white beans soaked overnight, rough-cut vegetables, bay leaves, cold water to cover, and the ham bone went in together. Long, slow simmer. 2 hours minimum, 3 if you had the time. The beans softened and released starch into the broth. The remaining ham fell off the bone in shreds. The collagen from the bone made the finished broth silky and rich in a way that bouillon alone couldn't replicate. By serving time, you had a thick, smoky, deeply satisfying soup that cost almost nothing beyond the dried beans. In 1970s kitchens, that ham bone was never a throwaway. It was the beginning of the next 3 meals. Watergate Salad. Named for the scandal that dominated the news in 1973, this was potluck culture at its most characteristic. Instant pistachio pudding powder stirred together with canned crushed pineapple, frozen whipped topping, miniature marshmallows, and chopped pecans. Refrigerated for an hour until firm. It came out pale green, fluffy, sweet, and cold. The pistachio flavor was entirely artificial and entirely of its moment. Each spoonful delivered sweet pineapple, soft marshmallow, and that distinctive processed flavor that said 1970s party food in one taste. Serve in a clear glass bowl so the color showed. People either loved it immediately or were genuinely baffled by its existence. Either reaction was considered acceptable. It lasted days in the refrigerator, cost almost nothing, and appeared at every church potluck and neighborhood gathering for the better part of a decade. Beef Stroganoff. The real beef stroganoff called for tenderloin. American home kitchens in the 1970s substituted cheap stew beef or just ground beef, and the result appeared regularly in women's magazines as budget entertaining with European flair. You brown the beef with onions and canned mushrooms, set it aside, and built the sauce from cream of mushroom soup and sour cream in the same pan. Low heat, stirred smooth, the sour cream cutting through the richness of the soup with just enough tang to make you want another bite. Everything back together over egg noodles. Each forkful delivered creamy, vaguely earthy sauce, coating soft noodles with pieces of tender beef throughout. It tasted considerably more impressive than its cost suggested, which was the reason it kept showing up in print as a dinner party option. $2 fed 4 people, and the dish sounded like something you'd order at a restaurant. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. White bread, American cheese, margarine, and a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup made with milk instead of water. This was the rainy afternoon meal, the after-school meal, the meal that took 12 minutes from cold stove to table. The bread browned in the margarine while the cheese melted inside. The sandwich coming off the pan crackling, the cheese stretching in long strings when you pulled the halves apart. The soup simmered in a pot, smooth and brick red and sweet, tasting more like childhood than like actual tomatoes. You dipped the corner of the sandwich into the hot soup. The bread absorbed liquid at the edge while the center stayed crispy and the cheese held its heat. It cost less than 50 cents per person and made kids feel genuinely taken care of on the coldest days. Some combinations exist beyond preference, and this was one of them. Liver and onions. Beef liver cost pennies per pound and provided more iron than practically any other cut at the butcher counter. That was the entire case for it, made firmly by parents to children who were not persuaded. You dredged thin, dark purple slices in seasoned flour and fried them quickly in butter alongside a separate pan of caramelizing onions. Done right, meaning slightly pink in the center, liver was tender and savory. Done wrong, meaning cooked past that point, it turned grainy and bitter and unforgettable in the worst way. The flavor was intensely mineral and earthy, undeniably organy, nothing like any other meat. The onions provided sweetness that helped. Adults who grew up in genuinely hard times often had real affection for it because it represented meat when meat was scarce. Kids who didn't carry that history made their feelings known clearly and consistently. Liver disappeared from most tables as soon as budgets allowed something else. Wacky Cake. When egg prices climbed to 70 cents a dozen in the mid-70s, this Depression-era recipe came back into circulation. Wacky Cake contained no eggs, no butter, and no milk. The name came from the improbability of it. Flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, and salt mixed directly in the baking pan. 3 small craters poked into the dry ingredients, filled with vegetable oil, white vinegar, and vanilla. Cold water poured over everything, stirred with a fork, and baked. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda the way eggs would have, providing lift. Out came dark, moist chocolate cake with a genuine crumb and real flavor. You'd never taste the vinegar. A simple cocoa and water icing on top. And the whole cake cost under $1 and fed 8 people. It showed up at birthday parties and church socials, and nobody who ate it felt shortchanged. Ham salad sandwiches. After the holiday ham dinner, after the bone went into the soup pot, the remaining irregular scraps of meat went into ham salad. You chopped or ground it fine. Mixed it with mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, and a little yellow mustard, and spread it thick between 2 slices of white bread. The texture was spreadable and slightly chunky, pale pink, not particularly elegant to look at. The taste combined salty ham, sweet pickle, and creamy mayo in each bite. School lunchboxes across the country carried these sandwiches through most of the decade. One holiday ham, through careful management, produced sandwiches, soup, and sometimes a casserole across an entire week. Wasting expensive meat was simply not something that happened in a budget-conscious 1970s kitchen. Every scrap had a plan. Stuffed bell peppers. A pound of ground beef stuffed into 6 large green peppers with enough cooked rice meant the expensive ingredient went a very long way. You browned the meat with onions, stirred in rice and tomato sauce to make the filling, then packed each hollowed pepper firmly and baked them in a covered dish with a little water in the bottom. They came out soft and slightly collapsed, the pepper walls tender and sweet, the filling savory and tomatoey inside each one. Each pepper was a complete self-contained meal, protein and starch, and vegetable all in one. The presentation was quietly impressive. They looked like dinner had been thought about, like someone had made an effort, even though the dish was pure economy from start to finish. You ate them with a knife and fork, cutting through the soft wall to mix everything together on the plate. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. This one usually gets dismissed as a kid's lunch, but during tight weeks in the 1970s, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were legitimate adult dinner. 1 jar of peanut butter and 1 jar of grape jelly produced enough sandwiches to cover 20 or 30 meals. The per serving cost was almost unmeasurable. Peanut butter spread thick on one slice, jelly on the other, pressed together. The peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth. The jelly provided sweetness and just enough moisture to resolve it. The taste was the most recognizable combination in American food, triggering something close to cellular memory for anyone who grew up here. Adults ate these without shame when the grocery money ran out early because they were filling and nostalgic and required nothing from the stove. Rich households and struggling ones packed identical sandwiches in identical lunchboxes. The sandwich made no distinctions. Baked ziti with tomato sauce. Baked ziti was the Italian-American answer to tuna noodle casserole. Inexpensive, filling, suitable for feeding a crowd, and with a name that sounded considerably more festive than hamburger casserole. Ziti cooked just short of fully tender, mixed with jarred tomato sauce and ricotta or cottage cheese if the budget allowed, layered in a baking dish with mozzarella throughout and a heavier layer on top. Into the oven until the cheese melted and the edges went golden and slightly crispy. The kitchen smelled like a restaurant while it cooked, which was something few other dishes on this list could claim. Each forkful combined tender pasta, tangy sauce, and melted cheese. No meat required, which made it one of the most economical meals available while still feeling like something worth sitting down for. Porcupine Meatballs. These earned their name honestly. You mix ground beef with uncooked white rice, eggs, onion, and seasoning, rolled them into balls, and simmered them in tomato sauce. As they cooked, the rice inside each meatball absorbed moisture and expanded, individual grains pushing out through the surface like tiny quills. Kids who'd shown no interest in what was for dinner looked at the plate and immediately asked questions. The visual was genuinely charming and genuinely accurate to the name. The practical value was the rice doing 2 jobs simultaneously. It stretched the ground beef and provided the starch for the meal without requiring a separate pot. The tomato sauce absorbed meat flavor as everything cooked together, becoming a rich gravy worth spooning generously. 1 pound of beef fed 4 people completely, and dinner felt, in a small but real way, like it had been made with some imagination. Tuna twist casserole. This was tuna noodle casserole's slightly more colorful version, distinguished by spiral pasta and a couple of additions that made it look more considered than its price suggested. Rotini or fusilli held sauce in their spirals better than flat egg noodles. Into the dish went the pasta, drained tuna, cream of mushroom soup, frozen peas, and diced pimentos from a small jar, those little red flecks that added color throughout. Some families added diced celery for extra crunch. Potato chip topping crushed directly over everything before it went into the oven. The crunchy topping made it feel special enough for company, or at least special enough for a Friday night when kids expected something a little better than a plain weeknight meal. The pimentos and peas against the cream-colored filling made it look like someone had tried, which honestly they had. Wacky Meatballs. The tiki restaurant craze of the early 60s had mostly peaked by the 1970s, but its influence on home cooking lingered in dishes like these. Trader Vic's and similar restaurants had introduced Americans to sweet and sour Polynesian flavors, and home cooks were still recreating versions of those sauces well into the decade. Ground beef meatballs made with crushed saltines as the binder, browned until colored, then simmered in a glossy sauce of pineapple chunks, green bell pepper, brown sugar, cider vinegar, soy sauce, and ketchup, thickened with cornstarch to a bright, sticky finish. Served over white rice. The sweet pineapple against savory beef, the tangy sauce coating everything, the bell pepper providing crunch. It tasted unlike anything else on a 1970s weeknight table, and that was the point. Dinner parties and casual family nights both got this one. It traveled well and reheated easily, which made it useful for hosts who wanted to cook ahead. Deviled ham logs. Cocktail parties in the 1970s had their own specific food language. Deviled ham logs appeared on those glass trays reliably, made ahead and kept cold, sliced, and spread on crackers by guests who generally went back for more. Canned deviled ham mixed thoroughly with softened cream cheese, seasoned with Worcestershire sauce or hot sauce or onion powder, depending on the household. Shaped into a cylinder using plastic wrap, rolled in chopped pecans or crushed potato chips or fresh parsley, then refrigerated until firm throughout. The exterior provided crunch and visual interest. The interior was smooth and deeply savory. Smoky ham flavor combined with rich cream cheese into something genuinely addictive in the way that salty and creamy combinations tend to be. It could be made 3 days ahead and held perfectly in the refrigerator. Harvey Wallbangers and tequila sunrises on one side of the table, deviled ham log on the other. That was a 1970 Saturday evening. Tomato aspic with veg-all. Savory gelatin was a legitimate and respected category of food in the 1970s, stretching back through decades of American entertaining before it. Tomato aspic was one of its most refined expressions, and it appeared on buffet tables and holiday spreads across the country. Tomato juice seasoned with lemon, Worcestershire, celery salt, hot sauce, and a pinch of sugar, combined with bloomed, unflavored gelatin and a can of veg-all mixed vegetables. Poured into a ring mold and refrigerated until completely firm. Unmolded onto lettuce leaves, it held its shape and wobbled slightly, deep red and glossy, served with a dollop of mayonnaise. The taste was bright and acidic, cold and silky, something like a chilled Bloody Mary with vegetables suspended throughout. By modern standards, it's an unusual concept. For those who grew up with it at holiday tables, it sits in memory alongside everything else from that era. Specific, recognizable, and entirely its own thing. Ham and Banana Hollandaise. This one appeared in women's magazines of the era with complete sincerity, presented as an elegant luncheon option. Ripe bananas wrapped in ham slices, baked with mustard and lemon juice, and served with hollandaise sauce poured over the top. Garnished with parsley and paprika. Serve alongside rice pilaf. The logic drew on the decades' ongoing enthusiasm for Hawaiian-inspired cooking. The pairing of sweet fruit with savory meat that had been appearing on tables since pineapple-glazed ham steaks became fashionable. The banana offered sweetness, the ham offered salt, the hollandaise offered richness. In practice, the combination produced something genuinely unlike anything else. Warm soft banana against salty cured meat under a rich egg sauce. Whether that was appealing depended entirely on the person eating it. What's worth noting is that home cooks tried it without excessive hesitation. Magazines said try this, and people tried it. That openness, that willingness to attempt something unfamiliar, was its own kind of quality. Jell-O 1, 2, 3. General Foods introduced this product in 1969, and it became a fixture of 1970s family desserts throughout the decade. One powder, mixed with water and chilled, separated on its own into 3 distinct layers. Clear gelatin on the bottom, thick mousse in the middle, light foam on top. It came in strawberry, orange, and raspberry, and was served in clear glasses specifically so the layers showed. Children were genuinely mesmerized by the science of it. You made one thing, and the refrigerator turned it into 3 things arranged neatly on top of each other, each with a different texture. The bottom layer was firm. The middle was creamy and dense. The top was airy and light. 1 spoonful combined all 3. It was discontinued in the early 1990s and remembered fondly enough that homemade versions circulated for years afterward from people trying to recreate it. Dessert that looked like you'd done something impressive when all you'd done was stir a powder into water and wait. Cheese fondue. The fondue pot was a 1970s status symbol. Sets were given as wedding gifts and displayed in kitchens as evidence of sophistication. The dish had come from Switzerland, moved through American restaurants in the 60s, and settled into home entertaining by the early 70s. Gruyere, an emmental melted in white wine and a clove of garlic, seasoned with kirsch and nutmeg, kept warm over the fondue burner while guests surrounded it with long-handled forks and cubes of crusty bread. The bread went in, swirled to pick up a thick coating, lifted carefully. Party tradition held that dropping your bread into the cheese meant you owed a kiss or the next round of drinks. The rule existed to keep people engaged and laughing, to make dinner a social event rather than just a meal. Beyond the cheese itself, adventurous hosts offered potato cubes, apple slices, or ham to dip. The chocolate fondue variation followed. The whole trend produced enough dedicated cookbooks to fill a shelf. Hamburger Boats. Ground beef, a can of tomato soup, toasted hamburger buns, and American cheese. The same basic ingredients as a plain hamburger, arranged differently, given a name, and turned into something kids actually got excited about. You toasted the bun halves until firm enough to hold filling, browned the beef with onions, stirred in the tomato soup to create a slightly sweet, thickened meat mixture, and spooned it into each bun half generously. A slice of American cheese draped over the top, melting from the heat of the filling underneath. Toppings were individual: sliced olives, pickled chips, crushed potato chips. The personalization was the point. Each person dressed their own boat. Dinner became a small decision-making event, which for children was the difference between sitting down reluctantly and sitting down with some interest. 1 pound of beef fed 4 people and left everyone satisfied. Creativity with presentation cost nothing extra. Beef stroganoff with hamburger. This appeared in community cookbooks across the country through most of the decade. The most economical version of a dish that had already been adapted significantly from its Russian origin. Ground beef replaced stew beef, and the result was still convincingly good. Brown a pound of ground beef with onions until the meat had real color at the edges. Add sliced mushrooms. Let them cook down. Build the sauce with cream of mushroom soup and sour cream. A little Worcestershire, salt, and pepper. Everything simmered together briefly and served over egg noodles. The sour cream provided the tang that made stroganoff, cutting through the richness of the soup and coating every noodle with something genuinely satisfying. It was a single skillet meal except for the noodle pot. The ingredients were pantry and refrigerator staples. The whole dinner cost around $2 and tasted like something you'd see on a sit-down restaurant menu. That gap between cost and impression was exactly what families in the 1970s were trying to close every single night. Crepes Suzette. And we end not with austerity, but with aspiration. Because alongside all of these budget meals and stretched ingredients, families in the 1970s were also reaching towards something more impressive when the occasion allowed. Julie, a child, had spent the 60s making French cooking accessible through television, and her influence was still spreading into home kitchens a decade later. Crepes Suzette was the most theatrical expression of that influence. Thin, delicate crepes folded in quarters and warmed in a sauce of caramelized sugar, butter, orange juice, and zest, then flamed with Grand Marnier at the table. The blue flame lasted only seconds, but that was the whole performance. Guests leaned in. The smell of caramelizing orange and burning liqueur filled the dining room. The finished crepes were delicate and rich, the sauce bright and buttery and slightly boozy. It was the kind of dessert you made when you wanted dinner to end as a memory rather than just a meal. From 19-cent mac and cheese on Wednesday to Crepes Suzette on Saturday. That was the full range of a 1970s kitchen. Practical and beautiful, constrained and ambitious, always trying to feed people well with whatever was available. Those cooks deserve to be remembered for both ends of that range. If you grew up eating any of these, tell me in the comments. Which ones do you still make? Which ones disappeared from your table the moment the budget allowed something else? And if you'd like to keep going through the food that shaped American life decade by decade, subscribe below. There are more kitchens to visit and more stories to tell.